The screaming stopped at noon. By then, the Mongol hordes had been working for 6 hours straight, methodically peeling away layers of human flesh with the precision of butchers preparing meat for market. What began as a city of 200,000 souls had become a charnel house so horrific that even hardened warriors who'd witnessed countless battles across the steppes had to step away and vomit. This is the story of Otrar, a massacre so brutal it redefined human cruelty for centuries to come. But here's what most people don't realize about this 13th century nightmare. The man who ordered this industrial-scale torture wasn't some bloodthirsty barbarian drunk on power. He was Genghis Khan, arguably history's most successful military strategist, and every skinned-alive victim, every flayed corpse, every creative torture method was calculated political messaging designed to prevent future resistance. You think modern warfare is brutal? Medieval siege tactics look like playground disputes compared to what the Mongols perfected at Otrar. They turned systematic terror into state policy, mass torture into diplomatic communication, and human suffering into the most effective psychological weapon in history. But the true horror of Otrar wasn't just the scale of killing. It was how methodically they documented everything, keeping detailed records of torture techniques, execution methods, and population elimination strategies. The Mongols weren't just committing genocide, they were perfecting it. Over the next hour, I'm going to walk you through the complete destruction of a civilization, starting with the single diplomatic insult that triggered the bloodiest retaliation in human history. You'll discover how one governor's greed led to 200,000 deaths, why Mongol torture methods were specifically designed to maximize psychological impact, and most disturbing of all, how ordinary people became willing participants in their neighbors' systematic extermination. By the end of this video, you'll understand why historians consider Otrar not just a massacre, but a blueprint for modern ethnic cleansing that influenced military strategy for the next 800 years. The techniques pioneered here would later appear in Nazi death camps, Soviet purges, and countless other atrocities. This isn't ancient history gathering dust in libraries. This is the origin story of systematic human disposal that still echoes through our modern world. The psychological warfare tactics developed at Otrar are being used right now in conflicts across the globe. But before we dive into the bloodbath that consumed an entire city, we need to understand the man whose diplomatic miscalculation started it all. Because the governor who sealed Otrar's fate wasn't some minor provincial official. He was Inalchuk, the most powerful administrator in the Khwarezmian Empire, a man so wealthy he thought himself untouchable by barbarian threats from the steppes. He was about to learn that no amount of gold could buy protection from Mongol justice. Picture this. It's 1218 and Inalchuk is living his best life as governor of Otrar, one of the richest trading cities on the Silk Road. Caravans arrive daily loaded with silk from China, spices from India, and precious metals from across Central Asia. The taxes alone make Inalchuk richer than most kings, and he's built himself a palace that rivals anything in Baghdad or Constantinople. Then comes news that changes everything. A trade delegation has arrived from some upstart Mongol chieftain, claiming to represent something called the Great Khan. The delegation carries goods worth 500,000 gold dinars, more wealth than most armies see in a lifetime. They're requesting safe passage and trading rights with the Khwarezmian Empire. Inalchuk takes one look at these 450 merchants with their strange clothes and foreign faces, and he sees opportunity. Not diplomatic opportunity, financial opportunity. Why negotiate trading rights when you can just take everything they own? Here's what most people don't realize about medieval international law. Killing trade ambassadors wasn't just theft. It was a declaration of war. Every ruler understood this. Every governor knew the consequences. Inalchuk knew exactly what he was doing when he ordered the massacre of the entire Mongol delegation, but he thought geography would protect him. The Mongol heartland was thousands of miles away across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. How could scattered nomads possibly threaten a fortified city protected by the world's most powerful empire? The Khwarezmians had 400,000 soldiers. The Mongols were just horse archers playing at civilization. Inalchuk couldn't have been more wrong. The news reached Genghis Khan in winter of 1218. According to the secret history of the Mongols, when messengers described how his ambassadors had been executed and their goods stolen, the great Khan didn't explode in rage. He didn't immediately call for war councils or begin mobilizing armies. Instead, he climbed alone to the top of a hill, removed his hat, and prayed to Tunguri, the eternal blue sky. For 3 days and nights, he remained there without food or water, asking the spirits of his ancestors for guidance. When he finally descended, his decision was absolute. The Khwarezmian Empire would cease to exist. Not conquered, not defeated. Eliminated so completely that future generations would forget it ever existed. But here's what made Genghis Khan different from every other conqueror in history. He didn't just want to win battles, he wanted to send a message that would prevent future conflicts by making resistance seem impossible. The destruction of Otrar wasn't just punishment for killing his ambassadors, it was strategic terror designed to make every other city surrender without fighting. The psychological warfare began before the first Mongol soldier crossed the border. Genghis Khan sent spies throughout Central Asia spreading detailed stories about what happened to cities that resisted Mongol armies. These weren't propagandalized, they were factual accounts of systematic destruction, so horrific they served as their own deterrent. Cities that surrendered immediately were spared. Those that resisted faced complete annihilation. Not just death for the soldiers, but torture and slavery for every man, woman, and child within the walls. The choice was binary: submit or suffer beyond imagination. The Mongol war machine that marched toward Otrar in 1219 was unlike anything the medieval world had seen. This wasn't an army in the traditional sense. It was a mobile genocide apparatus perfected through decades of conquest across the steppes. 200,000 Mongol warriors divided into tumens of 10,000 men each. Every tumen was self-sufficient, carrying its own siege equipment, engineers, and specialists trained in the systematic destruction of urban centers. They moved faster than any army in history, covering up to 180 miles per day through rotating fresh horses. But speed was just one advantage. The Mongols had revolutionized siege warfare by incorporating Chinese engineering techniques with Central Asian mobility. They carried portable catapults that could be assembled in hours, fire arrows that spread flames faster than defenders could extinguish them, and, most terrifying of all, captive populations from previous conquests who were forced to build siege equipment and storm walls. Imagine defending your city and realizing the people building ladders to scale your walls are citizens from neighboring towns who've been enslaved and forced to participate in their own people's destruction. The psychological impact was devastating before the fighting even began. The Mongol approach to siege warfare was systematically brutal. They didn't just want to capture cities, they wanted to break the spirits of defenders so completely that future resistance would seem hopeless. Every siege followed the same pattern: surround completely, offer surrender terms, then demonstrate what happened to those who refused. The demonstration usually involved the systematic torture of captives where defenders could see and hear everything. The message was clear: surrender now or watch your loved ones suffer fates worse than death. As winter turned to spring in 1219, Mongol scouts began appearing in the hills around Otrar. Not attacking, just watching, counting defenders, mapping escape routes, taking notes on fortifications. The psychological pressure was intentional. Let the defenders know they were being studied like specimens before dissection. Inalchuk had options. He could have surrendered, paid tribute, even negotiated some face-saving compromise. The Khwarezmian Empire still had hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The Sultan could have sent reinforcements. Diplomatic solutions remained possible. Instead, Inalchuk chose defiance. When Mongol envoys approached under flags of truce offering final surrender terms, he had them shot from the walls. When his own advisors suggested negotiation, he accused them of cowardice and threatened execution for anyone who spoke of surrender. Perhaps he genuinely believed his walls were impregnable. Perhaps he trusted that the Sultan's armies would arrive in time. Or perhaps he simply couldn't imagine that foreign barbarians could threaten a governor of his status and power. Whatever his reasoning, Inalchuk sealed the fate of every person in Otrar with his arrogance. The siege began in spring 1220. What happened over the next 6 months would redefine human cruelty and establish templates for systematic extermination that military strategists study to this day. But before we dive into the methodical destruction of an entire city, you need to understand the specific torture techniques the Mongols had perfected during their conquests across Asia. Because what they did to the people of Otrar wasn't random violence. It was calculated psychological warfare using human suffering as a weapon. The flaying process alone took specific training to perform correctly. Too fast and the victim died before maximum terror could be achieved. Too slow and the demonstration lost its impact on watching defenders. Mongol executioners practiced on animals for months before being allowed to work on human subjects. They had standardized procedures for everything. The optimal number of cuts to keep someone conscious during skinning. The precise depth of wounds that would cause maximum pain without immediate death. The specific techniques for removing organs while keeping victims alive to scream warnings to their compatriots. This wasn't sadism. It was military science applied to human psychology. Every scream served a purpose. Every display of mutilated bodies carried a message. Surrender now or join them. The true horror of what happened at Otrar wasn't just the scale of killing, it was how efficiently the Mongols had systematized terror into an exact science. The siege walls around Otrar stretched for 15 miles, a perfect circle of death that no living soul could cross. But these weren't ordinary siege lines. The Mongols had learned something crucial during their conquest of the Jin dynasty. Starvation was effective, but terror was faster, and time was a luxury they couldn't afford with the entire Khwarezmian Empire mobilizing against them. So they built what military historians now call theaters of instruction. Raised platforms positioned where Otrar's defenders could see everything happening to captured civilians. These weren't random acts of cruelty. They were carefully choreographed demonstrations designed to break enemy morale through systematic horror. The first performance began at dawn on the third day of siege. Mongol warriors dragged 12 captured farmers onto the platforms, men who'd been caught trying to flee the city with their families. What happened next was recorded by Persian chroniclers in detail so precise it reads like a medical textbook. The lead torturer, a Chinese engineer who'd mastered these techniques during the conquest of Beijing, began with what the Mongols called the lesson of layers. Using razor-sharp knives made specifically for this purpose, he peeled away strips of skin starting from the extremities. Not random cuts, but precise incisions that followed nerve pathways to maximize pain while preserving consciousness. The screams carried across the entire city. Children woke from sleep. Mothers grabbed their babies and ran to interior rooms trying to muffle the sounds. But the acoustics were intentional. The Mongols had positioned their torture platforms to create an echo chamber that amplified every cry of agony. Defenders on the walls watched in paralyzed horror as their neighbors, their friends, their family members were systematically dismantled while still alive. The psychological impact was immediate. Several guards threw down their weapons and tried to surrender. Inalchuk had them executed for cowardice, their bodies thrown from the walls as a message to both his own men and the Mongols below. But the Mongols weren't finished with their lesson. The second day brought what their field manuals called creative instruction. They'd learned during the conquest of Samarkand that variety prevented defenders from becoming numb to standard torture methods. Predictable horror lost its effectiveness. Innovation maintained psychological pressure. They introduced techniques that would make modern war crimes tribunals struggle for adequate language. Victims were suspended by hooks inserted through non-vital organs, keeping them alive for days while their bodies slowly tore apart under their own weight. Others were partially buried with only their heads exposed, then covered with honey to attract insects that would eat them alive over weeks. The most disturbing innovation was what witnesses called the mirror treatment. Mongol engineers had developed polished metal surfaces that could reflect sunlight with pinpoint accuracy. They used these to slowly blind and burn captives while forcing family members to watch, knowing that everyone on Otrar's walls could see the reflections and understand exactly what was happening. Each technique served multiple purposes. The immediate goal was breaking defender morale through terror. The secondary objective was field testing torture methods that could be refined and standardized for future sieges. The Mongols were building a catalog of human suffering, documenting which approaches produced the fastest psychological collapse in enemy forces. Persian chroniclers described defenders weeping openly on the walls, some begging Inalchuk to surrender before more civilians were captured. But the governor had painted himself into a corner. Surrendering now would mean admitting his initial decision to kill the Mongol ambassadors was wrong. His pride had become more important than his people's lives. The third week brought the systematic torture of women and children, a escalation that broke the last vestiges of defender morale. The Mongols had discovered through previous campaigns that male soldiers could sometimes endure watching other men suffer, but watching their wives and daughters tortured created complete psychological collapse. They developed specific procedures for maximizing this impact. Families were tortured together, with children forced to watch their mothers suffer before experiencing their own torment. The sounds that emerged from these sessions weren't entirely human anymore. They were frequencies of agony that human vocal cords could barely produce. Inalchuk tried to maintain discipline through increasingly harsh punishments. Guards who showed weakness were flogged, officers who suggested negotiation were demoted. Anyone caught speaking of surrender faced immediate execution. But terror has its own logic, and that logic was working against him. The breaking point came during the fourth week when Mongol catapults began launching severed heads over the city walls. Not random heads, but the heads of specific people that defenders recognized. Farmers who'd supplied the city with grain. Merchants who'd been trusted friends. Children who'd played in Otrar streets just weeks earlier. Each head carried a wooden tag with a message carved in Persian. Your governor's pride demands your death. How many more will die for his honor? The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. Defenders began to see their situation not as heroic resistance, but as senseless sacrifice to feed one man's ego. But the Mongols weren't relying solely on terror. They'd perfected the art of siege warfare through decades of conquest, incorporating techniques from Chinese, Persian, and Arab military traditions. Their engineers had developed portable trebuchets that could be assembled and disassembled in hours, allowing rapid repositioning to target weak points and fortifications. More importantly, they'd learned to use captive populations as expendable siege equipment. Prisoners from previous conquests were forced to build ladders, dig tunnels, and storm walls in the initial waves of attack. If they refused, their families were tortured to death in front of them. If they fought with insufficient enthusiasm, they were flayed alive as examples to others. This created a horrific moral dilemma for defenders. The people climbing their walls weren't Mongol soldiers, but enslaved civilians from neighboring cities who'd been forced into combat. Killing them was self-defense, but it also meant murdering innocent victims of the same conquest that now threatened Otrar. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Defenders were simultaneously watching their neighbors tortured below, fighting enslaved civilians on the walls, and knowing that surrender meant joining both groups in systematic extermination. Some guards simply walked away from their posts, abandoning the walls to find corners where they could die quietly without participating further. By the fifth week, sections of Otrar's walls were barely defended. Not because defenders had been killed, but because they'd lost the will to fight. The Mongol strategy of psychological destruction was working exactly as planned. They'd broken enemy resistance without losing significant numbers of their own warriors. But Genghis Khan wasn't satisfied with simple conquest. The death of his ambassadors demanded special punishment, and he decided to make Otrar an example that would be remembered for centuries. The city's destruction would be so complete, so methodically horrific, that future enemies would surrender immediately rather than risk similar treatment. The final assault began not with military attack, but with what Mongol records call the harvest of information. They needed to identify every person of importance within the city, from government officials to wealthy merchants to religious leaders. These individuals wouldn't be killed quickly. They would become teaching tools and an extended demonstration of what happened to those who opposed the Great Khan. Mongol intelligence networks had been operating inside Otrar for months, recruiting informants through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and terror. These collaborators provided detailed lists of targets, maps of important buildings, and most crucially, information about which residents had family members already captured. The leverage was devastating. Fathers were told their children would be spared if they identified government officials. Mothers were promised their daughters wouldn't be violated if they revealed where wealthy families hid their gold. Husbands were offered quick deaths for their wives in exchange for information about military preparations. Most people broke under this pressure, not because they were cowards, but because the alternative was watching loved ones suffer unimaginable torment while providing no benefit to anyone. The Mongols had engineered situations where betrayal seemed like the only merciful option available. As spring turned to summer, Atrar's walls began showing visible damage from constant bombardment. But more importantly, the city's social fabric was disintegrating under psychological pressure. Neighbors no longer trusted each other. Families argued about whether to attempt escape or prepare for siege's end. Government officials began making private plans that didn't include defending the city. Inalchuk responded to growing dissent with increasingly brutal repression, public executions for defeatist talk, torture for anyone caught hoarding food, mass arrests based on rumors of collaboration. He was creating the same climate of terror inside the city that the Mongols were creating outside, accelerating the psychological collapse he was trying to prevent. The irony wasn't lost on Otrar's residents. Their own governor was now torturing them to prevent them from surrendering to avoid torture. The distinction between defender and attacker was blurring as Inalchuk's methods became indistinguishable from his enemies. This was exactly what Genghis Khan had predicted. Prolonged siege didn't just starve cities into submission. It turned defenders against each other, creating internal conflicts that made final conquest easier. The Mongols had learned to weaponize time itself, using extended pressure to transform enemy unity into enemy fragmentation. By midsummer, sections of Atrar's population were actively working to end the siege through surrender, sabotage, or assassination of their own leadership. The city was consuming itself from within, while Mongol forces waited patiently outside, occasionally adding fresh horror to their torture demonstrations to maintain psychological pressure. The final phase was approaching, and when it came, the systematic destruction of Otrar would establish precedents for industrial-scale extermination that would influence military strategy for the next 8 centuries. But before that apocalypse could begin, one final act of defiance would seal the city's fate and ensure that its destruction would be remembered as the most methodical massacre in human history. The breaking point came not through military defeat, but through something far more insidious. Hunger had become a weapon more effective than any catapult or siege engine the Mongols possessed. By the 6th month of siege, Otrar's food supplies had dwindled to nothing, and the psychological torture of watching neighbors slowly starve created fractures in the city's unity that no amount of patriotic speeches could repair. But this wasn't accidental starvation. The Mongols had perfected the science of siege logistics through decades of conquest. They knew exactly how much food a city of 200,000 required daily. They calculated precisely how long existing supplies would last under different rationing scenarios. They even factored in the psychological impact of malnutrition on defender morale. Most importantly, they'd learned to control the pace of starvation for maximum psychological effect. Too fast, and defenders might launch desperate breakout attempts while still strong enough to fight effectively. Too slow, and enemy reinforcements might arrive before internal collapse occurred. The Mongols had discovered the optimal hunger timeline through systematic experimentation across dozens of previous sieges. The first signs appeared after 4 months when children began dying in significant numbers. Not from violence, but from simple malnutrition. Their small bodies couldn't survive on the increasingly meager rations that adults were struggling to share. Parents faced impossible choices: feed their children and watch themselves grow too weak to defend the walls, or maintain their strength while their babies wasted away. Inalchuk's response was characteristically brutal. He ordered the seizure of all remaining food supplies for redistribution to soldiers and government officials. Civilian families would receive what remained after military needs were met. In practice, this meant watching armed guards confiscate the last grain while children begged for scraps. The psychological impact was devastating. Defenders realized they were now protecting a system that prioritized their governor's survival over their own families' lives. The distinction between oppressor and protector had evaporated, leaving only the question of which form of death they preferred. Persian chroniclers documented what happened next with clinical precision. Desperate parents began attempting to lower children over the walls at night, hoping Mongol forces might show mercy to innocents. Instead, the Mongols captured these children and used them in their daily torture demonstrations, ensuring that parents on the walls could watch their own offspring being systematically dismantled as punishment for the escape attempt. The message was unmistakable. There would be no mercy for anyone associated with Otrar's resistance. Every person inside those walls, from the governor who'd ordered the ambassadors' deaths to the newborn babies who'd never made any choices at all, shared collective responsibility for defying Mongol authority. But hunger created opportunities that military assault couldn't achieve. Starving guards became susceptible to bribery in ways that well-fed soldiers never would. A handful of grain could purchase information that gold couldn't buy when stomachs were full. The Mongols began flooding the city with food supplies for anyone willing to provide intelligence about defensive preparations. The moral corruption was systematic and deliberate. They didn't want random information from desperate people. They wanted specific intelligence from individuals who could provide ongoing assistance. So they created networks of collaboration that required repeated betrayal, ensuring that anyone who began cooperating would be forced to continue or face exposure to their own neighbors. Within weeks, Mongol intelligence networks had detailed knowledge of every significant building, every important person, every potential escape route, and every defensive weakness inside Otrar. More importantly, they knew which residents were most likely to collaborate when final assault began, and which families could be used as leverage against stubborn resistors. The winter months brought a new horror that Persian chroniclers struggled to describe adequately. Cannibalism wasn't just occurring, it was becoming organized. Families were making collective decisions about which members to sacrifice for the survival of others. The elderly volunteered to die so their children might live another week. Parents drew lots to determine whose baby would feed the group. Inalchuk's government tried to maintain the fiction of civilized administration, even as citizens consumed each other's flesh. Official proclamations still spoke of honor and resistance, while guards distributed human meat according to military rank. The bureaucracy of cannibalism became as systematized as the bureaucracy of defense had been. The Mongols documented these developments with the same clinical attention they applied to siege engineering. They were studying how urban populations degraded under extended pressure, gathering data that would inform future conquests. The suffering inside Otrar wasn't just punishment for past defiance. It was research for perfecting future psychological warfare. By late winter, even the pretense of organized defense had collapsed. Sections of the wall stood unguarded, not because defenders had been killed, but because surviving guards were too weak from hunger to climb the stairs to their posts. Others had simply walked away, choosing to die in private rather than participate in the grotesque theater their city had become. The social hierarchy that had defined Otrar for generations evaporated as survival became the only meaningful status. Wealthy merchants who'd once commanded respect were now begging scraps from common soldiers. Government officials traded state secrets for moldy bread. Religious leaders abandoned their temples to search for rats in the sewers. This complete social collapse was exactly what Genghis Khan had engineered. He understood that cities weren't just military targets. They were complex social organisms that could be destroyed through systematic pressure on their vital functions. Starve the population, corrupt their leaders, turn neighbors against each other, and the walls became irrelevant because there was nothing left inside worth defending. The spring thaw brought fresh horrors as the ground softened enough to reveal the full extent of winter's casualties. Bodies that had been frozen in place for months began decomposing, creating disease outbreaks that finished what starvation had started. The smell of death became so overwhelming that even Mongol forces outside the walls had to adjust their positions to avoid the stench. But the Mongols weren't merely waiting for Otrar to die of natural causes. They'd been preparing for the final assault throughout the winter months, constructing siege engines of unprecedented size and developing new techniques for urban warfare that would maximize both military effectiveness and psychological terror. Chinese engineers in Mongol service had designed catapults capable of hurling not just stones, but containers filled with burning pitch, diseased animal carcasses, and most horrifically, the severed heads of captured civilians. Each projectile served dual purposes, causing physical damage to fortifications and delivering psychological messages to defenders. The containers of burning pitch weren't random fire attacks. They were precisely targeted to destroy specific buildings that Mongol intelligence had identified as crucial for defender morale. Granaries that might still contain hidden food supplies, religious buildings where residents gathered for comfort, government buildings that represented Inalchuk's authority. The diseased carcasses represented biological warfare in its most primitive but effective form. The Mongols had learned during their conquest of the Jin dynasty that plague could accomplish what conventional weapons couldn't, spreading through densely packed urban populations faster than any military assault. They were deliberately introducing epidemic disease as a siege tactic. Most disturbing were the severed heads because these weren't anonymous victims. Mongol intelligence networks had identified specific individuals whose deaths would cause maximum psychological impact. The head of a popular merchant whose family still lived inside the city, a respected religious leader who'd been captured during a failed escape attempt, children whose parents served in important government positions. Each head carried carved wooden tags with personalized messages for specific recipients. Your husband died screaming your name. Your daughter begged for mercy we couldn't provide. Your son's last words were asking why you abandoned him. The psychological warfare was surgical in its precision, targeting individual emotional vulnerabilities rather than relying on generalized terror. The final assault began not at dawn, as military tradition might suggest, but at noon on the spring equinox. The timing was deliberate. Mongol shamans had determined this was the most auspicious moment for complete destruction, when the balance between light and darkness would ensure that Otrar's elimination would be both physical and spiritual. The attack came from all directions simultaneously, with Mongol forces that had been secretly positioned during winter months emerging from concealed tunnels, scaling walls with ladders built by enslaved craftsmen, and breaching gates that collaborators had weakened from within. But this wasn't conventional urban combat. It was systematic extermination disguised as military assault. Every Mongol warrior carried specific instructions about their assigned targets. Not just military objectives like capturing strategic buildings or eliminating armed resistance, but detailed lists of individuals who required special treatment. Government officials who would be kept alive for public torture. Wealthy families whose execution would be filmed for psychological warfare purposes. Religious leaders who would be forced to renounce their faith before being killed. The speed of collapse was stunning even by Mongol standards. Sections of wall that had stood for months fell within hours, as starving defenders either fled their posts or actively assisted the attackers. Gates opened from inside as collaborator networks activated. Entire neighborhoods surrendered without resistance, hoping cooperation might earn mercy that military history suggested would never come. But the most chilling aspect of Otrar's fall wasn't the military efficiency of its conquest. It was how quickly the city's remaining population began participating in their neighbors' destruction. Faced with the choice between identifying hidden enemies or joining them in torture chambers, most chose collaboration. Parents revealed where other families had hidden food supplies. Neighbors provided information about who had spoken against the Mongols. Friends betrayed friends in desperate attempts to purchase survival through others' suffering. The systematic nature of this betrayal wasn't accidental. The Mongols had spent months engineering situations where cooperation seemed like the only rational choice available. They had created moral frameworks where betrayal could be justified as mercy, where collaboration could be rationalized as protection for loved ones, where participation in atrocities could be defended as necessary survival. Within 6 hours of the final assault's beginning, organized resistance had ceased to exist. Not because defenders had been militarily defeated, but because the social bonds that made collective defense possible had been systematically destroyed through months of psychological warfare. Otrar hadn't fallen to superior military force. It had been dissolved through the careful application of terror, starvation, and moral corruption. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the conquered city, Mongol forces began implementing the final phase of Genghis Khan's justice. The systematic extermination wasn't random violence or uncontrolled military rage. It was carefully planned demographic engineering designed to ensure that Otrar's defiance would never be repeated and never be forgotten. The sorting process began immediately. Residents were divided into categories that determined their fate: government officials and military leaders who would face extended public torture, craftsmen and engineers who might be useful as slaves, young women who could be distributed among Mongol warriors, children who could be adopted into Mongol families, and everyone else who would be eliminated immediately. But even these categories contained subcategories that revealed the methodical nature of Mongol planning. Government officials were ranked by their level of responsibility for ambassador deaths. Military leaders were evaluated based on their effectiveness in organizing resistance. Craftsmen were tested for specific skills that Mongol forces required. The selection process was bureaucratic in its precision, treating human beings like inventory to be cataloged and processed. As the sun set on what had once been Otrar, the screaming began in earnest. Not the random cries of battle, but the systematized sounds of industrial-scale torture conducted according to procedures that had been refined through years of conquest. The Mongols had transformed mass murder into performance art, with every scream serving specific psychological purposes in their broader campaign of terror. The true horror was only beginning. The methodical destruction of Otrar's population would continue for weeks, with each day bringing new innovations in human suffering that would establish precedents for systematic extermination lasting centuries into the future. The documentation process began before the killing had even finished. Mongol scribes, protected by guards and positioned on elevated platforms, recorded every technique with the methodical precision of military engineers documenting siege tactics. They weren't just witnessing atrocities, they were creating instruction manuals for future campaigns. Each torture method was cataloged with clinical detail. The optimal angle for inserting hooks to suspend victims without causing immediate death. The precise depth of cuts required to peel skin while maintaining consciousness. The specific sequence of organ removal that would maximize suffering duration. These weren't the random acts of bloodthirsty barbarians. This was systematic research into the science of human suffering. The record-keeping went beyond mere technique. Mongol administrators documented the psychological impact of different torture methods on watching populations. Which approaches caused the fastest morale collapse among enemy forces? How long could public torture continue before observers became numb to the horror? What combination of visual and auditory trauma produced optimal terror for future sieges? One Persian chronicler who survived by hiding among corpses described the surreal bureaucracy of extermination. Mongol officials with clipboards moved through the torture grounds, making notes about victim reactions, timing executions with water clocks, and conducting what appeared to be systematic experiments in human degradation. They tested the effectiveness of family torture versus individual suffering. Parents were forced to choose which child would die first. Then observers recorded how quickly other defenders surrendered when witnessing these impossible decisions. Children were tortured in front of their parents, then the process reversed with careful documentation of which sequence produced faster psychological breakdown. The flaying demonstrations that had terrorized defenders for months now became assembly line operations. Mongol executioners worked in teams, with each specialist handling specific aspects of the skinning process. One would make the initial incisions, another would peel away muscle tissue, a third would ensure victims remained conscious throughout the procedure. But the true innovation was in the preservation techniques. Chinese engineers had developed methods for treating flayed skin to prevent decomposition, creating banners from human flesh that could be displayed for months without decay. These gruesome trophies would travel with Mongol armies to future sieges, serving as portable advertisements for the consequences of resistance. The psychological impact extended far beyond Otrar's walls. Merchants who'd witnessed the siege spread stories throughout Central Asia about the methodical nature of Mongol torture. These weren't exaggerated rumors designed to frighten enemies. They were factual accounts that served as their own deterrent, more effective than any military threat. Cities hundreds of miles away began surrendering before Mongol forces even appeared on the horizon. The mere possibility of facing Otrar's fate was enough to break resistance that might have lasted months under conventional siege. Genghis Khan had achieved his strategic objective, making war so horrible that future enemies would choose submission over suffering. But the extermination wasn't limited to torture demonstrations. The Mongols had developed systematic approaches to urban destruction that went far beyond killing the population. They understood that eliminating people wasn't enough. The very memory of resistance had to be erased from history. Specialized demolition teams moved through the Otrar with the efficiency of modern urban planners. But their goal was complete architectural elimination. Every building was cataloged before destruction to ensure nothing of significance survived. Government buildings were burned first, then religious structures, then wealthy neighborhoods, and finally common residential areas. The destruction followed specific patterns designed to maximize psychological impact on future enemies. Religious buildings weren't just demolished, they were desecrated in ways that violated the deepest beliefs of the local population. Sacred texts were burned publicly while captured priests were forced to participate in their own faith's destruction. Libraries presented special challenges because the Mongols had learned to value certain types of knowledge. Scientific and mathematical texts were preserved and sent to Karakoram for translation. Historical records were destroyed to prevent future generations from remembering Otrar's defiance. Literary works were burned unless they contained information useful for future military campaigns. The agricultural destruction was equally systematic. Mongol engineers diverted rivers to flood irrigation systems that had supported the region for centuries. Fruit trees were cut down and burned. Grain stores were poisoned to ensure no one could return and rebuild. The goal wasn't just conquering territory, it was making the land incapable of supporting organized resistance. Even the graves weren't spared. Mongol forces systematically desecrated burial grounds, scattering bones and destroying monuments to ensure that ancestors couldn't provide spiritual protection for future defenders. This wasn't random vandalism, it was cultural warfare designed to break the spiritual connections that might inspire future rebellion. The scope of destruction extended to the surrounding countryside. Villages that had supplied Otrar with food were eliminated with the same methodical thoroughness. Nomadic tribes that had traded with the city were hunted down and exterminated. The Mongols understood that urban centers existed within broader economic and social networks that had to be completely severed. Mongol cavalry units spread across the region like a plague, following detailed maps that identified every settlement, every water source, every potential refuge for survivors. Their orders were explicit. No structure left standing, no population left alive, no possibility of future resistance from any source. The environmental impact was staggering. Centuries of human development were erased in weeks of systematic destruction. Archaeological evidence suggests that some areas didn't recover their pre-Mongol population levels for over 300 years. Entire ethnic groups simply vanished from historical records, their languages and cultures eliminated so completely that modern scholars debate whether they ever existed. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Otrar's destruction was how efficiently the Mongols had solved the logistical challenges of mass murder. Previous conquerors had struggled with the practical difficulties of killing large populations quickly and efficiently. The Mongols approached this as an engineering problem requiring systematic solutions. They'd calculated the optimal number of executioners needed to process specific population sizes within target timeframes. They'd developed transportation systems for moving bodies away from execution sites to prevent disease outbreaks among their own forces. They'd even created rotation schedules for torture specialists to prevent psychological burnout that might reduce effectiveness. The medical knowledge required for their torture techniques was surprisingly sophisticated. Mongol executioners understood human anatomy well enough to keep victims conscious during procedures that should have caused immediate shock death. They knew which organs could be removed without causing rapid blood loss. They understood how to manipulate pain receptors for maximum psychological impact. Chinese physicians who'd been captured during previous campaigns were forced to contribute their medical knowledge to perfecting torture techniques. These doctors faced impossible moral choices: cooperate with systematic murder or watch their own families suffer the consequences of refusal. Most chose collaboration, then spent their remaining lives trying to rationalize their participation in industrialized cruelty. The psychological warfare extended beyond physical torture to encompass systematic humiliation, designed to break the spirit even before the body was destroyed. Religious leaders were forced to perform acts that violated their deepest beliefs. Government officials were made to publicly confess crimes they hadn't committed. Parents were required to participate in their own children's torture. These humiliation rituals served multiple purposes. They demonstrated Mongol power over both physical and spiritual aspects of human existence. They created moral corruption that made resistance seem meaningless. Most importantly, they produced collaborators who could be used to facilitate future conquests. The children of Otrar faced particularly calculated cruelty. Those deemed suitable for adoption into Mongol families were separated from their parents and systematically re-educated to forget their original identities. They were given new names, taught Mongol customs, and raised to become warriors who might someday participate in the conquest of their own people. This wasn't random cultural assimilation. It was deliberate identity destruction, designed to eliminate ethnic memory that might inspire future resistance. The Mongols understood that children represented the future of conquered peoples, so they developed systematic approaches to transforming enemy youth into loyal Mongol citizens. The older children who couldn't be assimilated faced different fates. Boys approaching military age were eliminated to prevent future rebellion. Girls were distributed among Mongol warriors as rewards for successful conquest. The selection process was as bureaucratic as any other aspect of the extermination, with careful record-keeping to ensure equitable distribution of human spoils. As autumn arrived, the systematic destruction of Otrar entered its final phase. The last survivors, mostly women and children who'd been kept alive for specific purposes, were processed according to predetermined schedules. The torture demonstrations that had lasted months were concluded with elaborate ceremonies designed to mark the complete elimination of resistance. Genghis Khan himself arrived to oversee the final executions, not because he enjoyed witnessing suffering, but because his presence was necessary to validate the political message being sent. The Great Khan's personal involvement in Otrar's destruction would be reported throughout Central Asia, demonstrating that resistance to Mongol authority warranted the attention of the empire's highest leadership. The final ceremony lasted 3 days, with carefully choreographed executions designed to demonstrate different aspects of Mongol power. Government officials were flayed alive to show the consequences of diplomatic betrayal. Military leaders were drawn and quartered to demonstrate the futility of armed resistance. Religious authorities were burned alive to prove that no god could protect enemies of the Khan. But the most disturbing execution was reserved for Inalchuk himself, the governor whose greed had triggered this entire catastrophe. The Mongols had kept him alive throughout the siege and its aftermath, not for mercy, but because his death required special treatment that would serve as the climactic message of their campaign. They filled his mouth and nose with molten gold, a symbolic execution that referenced his original crime of stealing Mongol trade goods. But the process was designed to take hours rather than minutes, with careful temperature control to prevent immediate death while ensuring maximum suffering. The message was unmistakable. Those who stole from the Khan would pay with interest calculated in agony. As winter approached, the last Mongol forces departed from what had once been Otrar, leaving behind a landscape so thoroughly destroyed that travelers reported difficulty determining where the city had once stood. The systematic elimination had been so complete that even the geographical features had been altered to prevent future settlement. The psychological warfare campaign continued long after the physical destruction ended. Mongol agents spread detailed accounts of Otrar's fate throughout the Islamic world, ensuring that every potential enemy understood exactly what awaited those who chose resistance over submission. These weren't propaganda exaggerations. They were factual reports that served as their own deterrent. The techniques pioneered at Otrar became standard operating procedures for Mongol conquests across Eurasia. The systematic torture methods, the bureaucratic approach to mass murder, the psychological warfare tactics, and the complete elimination of urban centers were refined and replicated from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. Military historians studying these campaigns note the disturbing efficiency with which the Mongols had solved logistical challenges that had plagued previous conquerors. They'd created portable systems for siege warfare, standardized procedures for population elimination, and bureaucratic structures that could process mass murder with administrative efficiency. The templates developed during Otrar's destruction influenced military strategy for centuries. Ottoman forces used similar psychological warfare techniques during their European campaigns. Spanish conquistadors applied comparable systematic approaches to indigenous population elimination. Even modern military doctrines contain elements traceable to Mongol innovations in combining physical destruction with psychological terror. But perhaps the most chilling legacy of Otrar was how successfully the Mongols had demonstrated that systematic extermination could be conducted with bureaucratic efficiency rather than emotional rage. They'd transformed mass murder from chaotic violence into administrative procedure, creating precedents that would echo through history's darkest chapters. The winter winds that blew across the empty plain where Otrar once stood carried more than just dust and debris. They carried the knowledge that human civilization, no matter how ancient or powerful, could be erased completely through the systematic application of calculated cruelty. The lesson wasn't lost on future conquerors who would study Mongol methods and develop their own innovations in the science of systematic destruction. The mathematical precision of genocide at Otrar established formulas that would be studied in military academies for the next 8 centuries. But the true horror wasn't just the scale of killing. It was how efficiently the Mongols had documented every technique, creating an encyclopedia of systematic extermination that future conquerors would reference like a cookbook. Modern historians accessing Mongol archives in the 1960s discovered detailed operational manuals that read like industrial engineering reports. Optimal ratios of executioners to victims for maximum processing efficiency. Time motion studies of torture techniques to reduce labor costs while maintaining psychological impact. Even quality control standards for flaying procedures to ensure consistent terror messaging across different campaigns. The bureaucracy of death had reached scientific levels that wouldn't be seen again until the mechanized genocides of the 20th century. The Mongols had essentially invented industrial-scale murder 700 years before Henry Ford perfected assembly line production. Every scream was calculated, every death was documented, every innovation in human suffering was cataloged for future reference. But here's what makes Otrar's legacy particularly disturbing. The techniques didn't stay buried in Mongol archives. They spread through trade networks, diplomatic exchanges, and military advisors who carried this knowledge across continents. Chinese generals incorporated Mongol psychological warfare into their campaigns against internal rebels. Islamic armies adapted siege terror tactics for their own conquests. European crusaders learned systematic population elimination from Eastern military treatises. The ripple effects extended far beyond military applications. Urban planning began incorporating defensive measures against Mongol-style psychological warfare. Religious institutions developed new theological frameworks for understanding systematic evil. Legal systems created categories of crime that hadn't existed before witnessing industrialized torture. Even economic systems adapted to the reality of total warfare that could eliminate entire trading centers overnight. Merchants diversified their routes to avoid dependence on any single city that might face Otrar's fate. Banking systems developed portable wealth storage that could survive urban destruction. Insurance concepts emerged to protect against losses from systematic extermination. The psychological scars ran deeper than physical reconstruction. Survivors who'd witnessed Otrar's destruction carried trauma that affected generations of their descendants. Modern psychological studies of historical trauma suggest that the systematic nature of Mongol terror created inherited anxiety disorders that persisted centuries after the actual events. Children born decades after Otrar's fall exhibited stress responses to sounds reminiscent of siege warfare. Communities developed cultural practices designed to prevent the social fragmentation that had made Mongol conquest easier. Religious traditions incorporated prayers specifically asking for protection against the kind of calculated evil that had consumed an entire city. The linguistic impact reveals how deeply Otrar's destruction penetrated collective memory. Persian, Arabic, and Turkic languages all developed new vocabulary to describe types of systematic cruelty that hadn't required specific terms before Mongol campaigns. Words for bureaucratic torture, administrative execution, and calculated terror entered common usage because existing language couldn't adequately describe what people had witnessed. These linguistic innovations spread along the same trade routes that had once brought prosperity to Central Asia. Merchants, diplomats, and refugees carried not just goods and information, but specific terminology for describing systematic evil. The vocabulary of industrialized murder became part of human communication in ways that persist today. Modern conflict analysis reveals disturbing continuities between Mongol techniques and contemporary warfare methods. The systematic use of torture for psychological messaging, the bureaucratic organization of mass killing, the deliberate targeting of civilian populations to break military resistance, the documentation procedures that turn atrocities into administrative data. Intelligence agencies studying insurgency suppression have analyzed Mongol archives for insights into population control through terror. Military strategists examining urban warfare reference Mongol siege techniques for understanding psychological pressure points in modern cities. Even peacekeeping organizations study Mongol methods to better recognize early warning signs of systematic extermination. The technological evolution of warfare has made Mongol techniques more efficient rather than obsolete. Modern communication systems can spread psychological terror faster than Mongol horsemen ever could. Precision weapons can target specific buildings with accuracy that medieval catapults couldn't achieve. Digital surveillance provides intelligence-gathering capabilities that exceed even the most sophisticated Mongol spy networks. But the fundamental psychology remains unchanged. The same human vulnerabilities that Mongol forces exploited at Otrar exist in modern populations. The same social fractures that made resistance impossible still appear when communities face systematic pressure. The same moral corruptions that turned neighbors into collaborators continue to operate when survival requires betraying others. Contemporary examples of systematic extermination, from Rwanda to Bosnia to Myanmar, all contain elements traceable to techniques pioneered during Mongol conquests. The bureaucratic organization of killing, the use of existing social divisions to facilitate elimination, the creation of moral frameworks that make participation seem necessary or even virtuous. The most chilling realization is how little human nature has changed since 12i20. Given similar pressures, modern populations exhibit the same behavioral patterns that made Otrar's destruction possible. The capacity for both systematic cruelty and willing collaboration exists in every society, waiting for circumstances that activate these dormant potentials. Educational systems worldwide struggle with how to teach this history without creating despair about human nature. The lesson of Otrar isn't that humans are inherently evil, but that ordinary people can become willing participants in extraordinary horror when systems are designed to make collaboration seem rational and resistance impossible. The prevention of future Otrars requires understanding the systematic nature of how civilized societies can be transformed into killing machines. It's not enough to condemn individual cruelty. We must recognize the institutional structures, psychological pressures, and moral frameworks that make systematic evil possible. Modern human rights law emerged partly from studying historical atrocities like Otrar's destruction. The concepts of crimes against humanity, genocide, and systematic persecution all reference types of organized evil that the Mongols had perfected centuries earlier. Legal frameworks designed to prevent future massacres draw directly from analysis of past systematic exterminations. But law alone cannot prevent what happened at Otrar from recurring. The same human psychology that made 13th century systematic murder possible continues to operate in modern conflicts. The same institutional structures that facilitated Mongol bureaucratic killing appear in contemporary authoritarian systems. The same moral corruptions that turned victims into collaborators persist when survival depends on betraying others. The ultimate lesson of Otrar isn't about Mongol barbarity or medieval cruelty. It's about the systematic nature of evil and how quickly civilized societies can be transformed into participants in their own destruction. The techniques pioneered by Genghis Khan's forces continue to influence conflict worldwide, proving that some innovations in human suffering have troubling longevity. Today, when we see systematic persecution beginning anywhere in the world, we're witnessing the same processes that consumed Otrar 8 centuries ago. The technology may be more sophisticated, but the underlying psychology of systematic extermination remains essentially unchanged. Understanding this continuity isn't just historical curiosity, it's survival knowledge for a world where the capacity for organized evil continues to evolve, while human nature remains constant. The screaming stopped at Otrar in 1220, but the echoes continue to reverberate through every systematic atrocity that followed. The true horror wasn't just the death of 200,000 people. It was the creation of templates for turning human suffering into administrative procedure, proving that the most dangerous evil isn't chaotic violence, but organized cruelty implemented with bureaucratic efficiency. That's the legacy of Otrar. Not just a medieval massacre, but a blueprint for systematic extermination that continues to influence how humans destroy each other today. The Mongols didn't just conquer cities. They perfected the science of eliminating entire populations through calculated terror, leaving behind knowledge that would shape the darkest chapters of human history for centuries to come.